Welcome to Life Stories. In today's story, we will take you on an emotional journey of love, courage, and the power of standing up for those we care about. This is the story of Emma, a grandmother who notices the subtle changes in her granddaughter Sophie's behavior, leading her to uncover a hidden struggle. Through persistence and love, Emma takes the necessary steps to protect Sophie from emotional harm and helps her rediscover her joy. It's a tale of family, empathy, and healing. Stay tuned to hear how the story unfolds. And remember to subscribe to our channel to begin today's life story. It was a quiet afternoon in early spring, the sun casting a soft, golden light over the garden where tulips were beginning to bloom. The air was fresh and crisp, the kind of afternoon that makes you feel at peace with the world. I sat in my favorite rocking chair by the window, my hands resting on my lap, and watched the flowers gently sway in the breeze. There was a sense of serenity in the moment, but it wasn't enough to ease the worry that had been gnawing at me for weeks. My granddaughter, Sophie, had changed. She was no longer the lively, imaginative girl I had known for so many years. I couldn't help but think about how quickly life had shifted. 5 years ago, I had lost my husband, Thomas, to pneumonia. It felt as if my world had crumbled. I often found myself gazing at his photograph, missing his warm presence, the sound of his voice. But life moves on, and I had found comfort in spending time with Sophie. She had become my joy, my reason to smile after Thomas's passing. As I looked at the photograph of my husband, I spoke softly as if he were still with me. Thomas, I'm going to visit Sophie today. The house, though quiet, always felt full of life when Sophie was around. I missed her bright laugh, the way she would run up to me with arms outstretched, her eyes full of excitement, always eager to share a new drawing or an interesting story from school. But lately, she had been quieter, more withdrawn, her eyes not sparkling with the same enthusiasm they once had. I had noticed it during my recent visits, but I didn't want to believe it was anything serious. Still, I couldn't ignore the growing unease in my heart. I had retired from my job as an elementary school secretary a few years ago after 30 years of service. My days were now filled with simpler things, gardening, reading, and of course, spending time with Sophie. She was my closest companion, and I cherished our afternoons together. The thought of her being unhappy tugged at my heart. That afternoon, as I picked a few daisies from the vase by the door, I decided to visit her again. The drive was short, but my mind was restless with worry. I arrived at my son James's house, a 2-story home nestled in a peaceful suburban neighborhood. It was a place of comfort, one that had always felt like home, especially with James and his wife, Rebecca, living there. My son had grown into a kind, responsible man, and I was proud of the life he had built with Rebecca. They had designed the house together, and it was beautiful, full of light, warmth, and love. Still, despite all of that, something felt off today. Rebecca greeted me at the door with her usual smile, though there was something in her eyes that seemed strained. "Mom, thank you for coming," she said. Her voice was soft but held an edge of concern that I hadn't noticed before. "Sophie's upstairs doing her homework, but she'll be down in a minute when she hears you're here." I nodded, my heart lightening slightly at the thought of Sophie running down the stairs, excited to see me. I had known Rebecca for years, and I knew that her heart was in the right place, always trying to balance work, home, and family. She was a proofreader, and though her work kept her busy, she always made sure to create time for Sophie. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. When Sophie finally appeared at the top of the stairs, her small feet rushing down, I saw it in her face, a kind of weariness, a quiet sadness that didn't belong in her youthful expression. "Grandma," she exclaimed, leaping into my arms. I held her close, feeling the warmth of her small body against mine. It brought me comfort, but there was something else too, something I couldn't quite place. "I brought you some flowers," I said, holding out the daisies I had picked earlier. "Oh, they're beautiful, my favorite flowers." Sophie's face lit up as she accepted them, but as she smiled, I couldn't help but notice the shadow in her eyes. It was fleeting, but it was there. We went into the living room where Rebecca had prepared tea and cookies. And I casually asked Sophie, "How's school these days?" It was a question I had asked 1,000 times. But today it felt different. Sophie's gaze dropped to the table as she twirled her cookie between her fingers. A sign that she was uncomfortable. "It's okay, I guess," she replied in a quiet voice, her usual spark missing. Rebecca noticed the shift and gently prompted, "Didn't you get an award from your teacher? Tell Grandma about it." Sophie shrugged, her voice barely audible. "Just a little art award. Nothing special." I frowned. This was not the Sophie I knew. She loved art, always so proud of her drawings. I had expected her to be more excited about the award, to tell me all about it. But today she seemed distant, reluctant to share. As we sat there, sipping tea and nibbling on cookies, I couldn't help but wonder what was going on with my granddaughter. Something had changed, and I was determined to find out what it was. I couldn't ignore the feeling that Sophie was hiding something that made her act this way. And I, as her grandmother, needed to know what it was. It had been a few days since my last visit, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right with Sophie. The image of her quiet eyes, the way she had pulled away when I tried to ask about her schoolwork, haunted me. I knew I had to visit again, to find out what was truly going on. On a Wednesday afternoon, as promised, I drove over to James and Rebecca's house to spend time with Sophie. This time, I made sure to come a little earlier than usual. James and Rebecca both had work commitments, and I had noticed they had been distracted lately. Sophie had been getting quieter, and despite her parents' efforts, it was clear that something had changed in her. When I arrived, the house was calm, too calm, and there was an unusual stillness in the air that made my unease grow stronger. "Sophie, Grandma's here," I called out as I stepped into the living room, a familiar sense of warmth in my chest as I anticipated her joyful response. No sooner had I spoken than I heard the sound of little feet rushing down the stairs. Sophie appeared at the bottom of the staircase, and for the first time in a while, her face broke into a full smile. "Grandma," she cried, her arms reaching up to me. "Let's play a game today," I suggested, brushing a strand of hair from her face. Sophie's eyes sparkled a little as she nodded eagerly. I was relieved to see that gleam again, the one that had been absent during our previous encounters. It gave me hope that things could return to normal. As we walked to the kitchen, Sophie tugged at my hand. "Grandma, I drew a picture at school this week. Do you want to see it?" Her voice was soft, but I could hear the excitement beginning to return. I smiled and nodded, pleased that she seemed to be opening up. While Sophie went upstairs to get her drawing, I began preparing tea in the kitchen. I opened the fridge to gather the ingredients and, as I did, I noticed something on the door. It was a family calendar, filled with appointments, school activities, and other plans. However, several days were marked with red circles, 3 or 4 times a month, scattered at irregular intervals. It caught my attention immediately. These red circles didn't seem like normal reminders of meetings or events. They were different, marking specific days that seemed almost foreboding. I waited for Sophie to return with her drawing, but my mind was elsewhere. Why were these dates so significant? What were they marking? Sophie had always been so open with me about her schoolwork, her drawings, and her life, but now, she was pulling away. Her quietness, her reluctance to talk about the red circle days, they all pointed to something I couldn't ignore. When Sophie came back downstairs, she was holding her drawing proudly, but there was something about her posture, something that didn't sit right. She handed me the paper with a slight hesitance in her movements. I looked at the drawing, admiring her work as I always did. Yet, my eyes drifted back to the calendar once more. The red circles were still there, marking the days I knew I had to understand. I decided to bring it up casually, though my heart was heavy with the anticipation of what I might uncover. "Sophie, what are these red circles on the calendar?" I asked, my voice as gentle as I could make it. "Some special plans?" For a moment, Sophie froze, her eyes widened, and she looked like she'd been caught in a trap she didn't want to escape. The shift in her demeanor was instant, and I could see the fear in her eyes. After a long pause, she lowered her gaze to the floor and muttered, "It's nothing, but those days are always a bit unpleasant." Unpleasant? My heart sank as I processed her words. What could she possibly mean? Sophie had never been afraid of anything before. She was always so confident, full of life, and willing to share anything on her mind. But now, it seemed as though something, or someone, had made her afraid. Before I could press further, there was a sudden interruption. The phone rang, and I stepped away to answer it. When I returned, Sophie was sitting on the floor, spreading out her drawings. It was as though she was deliberately avoiding the conversation we had just started. I could see that she was trying to distract me, but I couldn't let it go. I decided to let it rest for the moment, knowing I had to be patient. But my heart knew that I couldn't ignore Sophie's change in behavior much longer. Something was wrong, I just didn't know yet what it was. Days passed, but my worries about Sophie only deepened. Her once lively spirit had been replaced with a quiet sadness that I couldn't ignore. I visited more often than usual, hoping that somehow, in some way, she would open up to me, that the walls she had built around herself would come down. But each time I saw her, she seemed more withdrawn, and her conversations grew shorter. I knew something was wrong, and I wasn't about to sit back and wait for her to come to me. One weekend, I decided that I would confront the issue head-on. Sophie's behavior had become harder to ignore, and the red circles on the calendar were too suspicious for me to brush aside. My son James and his wife Rebecca were preoccupied with work, as always, and I knew they were too wrapped up in their own lives to notice the subtle changes in Sophie. I had to take matters into my own hands. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I arrived early, just after breakfast. The house was calm, and there was a sense of anticipation in the air. I greeted Rebecca and James, but my mind was elsewhere. I could feel the weight of the situation pressing on me as I searched for Sophie. When I found her, she was in the living room, her favorite spot on the couch, scribbling something in her sketchbook. I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her brows furrowed with concentration, but there was an underlying exhaustion in her posture. I walked over to her and sat down gently on the couch. "Sophie, darling, is everything okay?" I asked, my voice calm but laced with concern. She looked up at me, her wide eyes betraying a flicker of fear, but she quickly averted her gaze. I could tell she was trying to hide something, but I wasn't going to let it go. Her silence made my heart ache. Sophie was never one to keep secrets from me, but now, it seemed as if she was carrying a burden too heavy to share. I tried again, this time softer. "Sophie, honey, I noticed those red circles on the calendar. Can you tell me what they mean? Why are those days so unpleasant for you?" I had to ask, even if it meant pushing her further than I had before. Sophie froze for a moment, her hands gripping her sketchbook tightly. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and confusion, as though she didn't know how to say what had been weighing on her for so long. Finally, she spoke in a soft whisper. "Grandma, those are the days Grandma Donna comes over to help me with my studies, but it's not like normal tutoring. She gets really angry if I make mistakes, and I don't know how to make her happy." I felt a cold shiver run through me as her words sank in. Donna, my daughter-in-law Rebecca's mother, had always seemed like a well-meaning woman. She was strict, yes, but I had never imagined that she could be the source of Sophie's distress. Sophie continued, her voice trembling. "When I get a math problem wrong, she gets really mad. She says I'm stupid and that if I don't get better, Mom and Dad won't love me anymore." The pain in Sophie's voice was unbearable. My heart broke for her as I realized just how deep the emotional wounds were. I gently pulled her into my arms, holding her close. "Sophie, darling, I'm so sorry you've been through this. You are not stupid, and your mom and dad love you more than anything in this world. No one, not even Grandma Donna, should make you feel like you're not enough. Sophie clung to me, the tears finally breaking free as she sobbed quietly into my shoulder. I held her tightly, wishing I could take away the hurt she had been carrying alone. This wasn't just about schoolwork. It was about fear of disappointing someone she loved, fear of not being good enough. And it was all because of Donna's harsh words and unreasonable expectations. I knew then that I had to act. This couldn't go on any longer. Sophie's emotional well-being was at stake, and I wasn't about to let Donna's rigid beliefs destroy the bright, creative soul she had once been. I made a decision right then and there. I would do whatever it took to protect Sophie and help her find her voice again. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to face it head-on. For Sophie's sake. The days that followed were filled with deep conversations and difficult decisions. I knew that confronting Donna would not be easy, but I couldn't stand by and watch Sophie suffer. I gathered all the courage I had left and decided it was time to speak up. To protect my granddaughter from the emotional abuse that had silently taken root in their home. With my son James and Rebecca, we had a serious conversation about Donna's behavior. They were shocked at first, but after seeing the video evidence I had gathered, they finally understood the depth of the problem. We decided together that Donna's days of tutoring Sophie alone were over. She would no longer be allowed to impose her harsh expectations on a young child who only wanted to learn and grow. Sophie's transformation was gradual, but it was beautiful to witness. Over the next few months, she slowly regained her confidence. Her once muted spirit began to shine again, and her artwork, once hidden behind self-doubt, flourished. Her smiles became genuine, her laughter filled the house again, and her love for drawing returned with a newfound passion. She was finally free from the fear that had been weighing her down. We spent more time together as a family, creating new memories of joy and laughter. The days marked with red circles on the calendar were replaced with bright, colorful symbols of happiness, days spent with those who truly loved and cared for her. Sophie was no longer the quiet, anxious girl I had once known. She was strong, resilient, and full of life again. And as I watched her proudly hold up a drawing of a vibrant spring landscape, I knew that the journey we had all gone through had been worth it. We had learned valuable lessons about love, empathy, and the importance of standing up for what's right. If you'd like to hear more life stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for the latest videos. Stay tuned for more inspiring tales of resilience and growth.